Dear Alex, this time we are going to talk about wolves in Middle Ages times. Wolves as a symbolical animal in Northern Europe, and what was the perception of medieval people and medieval clergy about wolves? How they perceived wolves? Did they perceive them as helpers of devil, like witches and werewolves, or they had more balanced attitude towards the wolf?
Well, if we're talking about the Christian period
Yeah.
in medieval Northern Europe, then the wolf is generally a negative symbol, a metaphor for the devil, and this is explicitly stated. And generally speaking, within its broader symbolism, the wolf is representative of violence, of danger. It's something to be feared. And occasionally also something to be admired, but not very often. We do sometimes have positive uses of the wolf. So, for example, it's an ancient symbol, of course, but Romulus and Remus, so the wolf and twins from ancient Rome, then becomes adopted as a symbol of medieval Rome and the Roman Church, the Catholic Church. So occasionally you see uses where the wolf has this positive value. We also see the wolf featuring in some saints' lives, but again, it's really where the power of God is showing how every animal can ultimately fall under the divine mandate of creation. So the wolf itself is, if you like, behaving in a different way in these stories where it's demonstrating the power of saints, for example. But generally speaking, that the wolf is not popular. It doesn't, for example, feature very often in heraldic emblems. Now, heraldry is, if you like, a symbol system that develops in the 12th century that becomes widely adopted. And in fact, it's used around the world today to signify identity of individuals or corporations or entire states in the modern context. And the wolf doesn't feature very often compared to, for example, animals like the lion and the eagle that are much more popular and considered much more noble. But there are examples where the wolf does feature, and in some places it's quite popular. So in northern, what is today northeastern Spain, the wolf outnumbers the lion in terms of its popularity within these heraldic symbols. So occasionally we do see things. It's usually where people have a name which includes a wolf element in them, and they adopt the wolf as their personal symbol because they're named after the wolf, or they have a wolf sort of personal name element. So it's like you said, it's a bit more complicated, but I think the bottom line is that most people, if they encountered a wolf or if they heard wolves howling, they would not feel very comforted by this. It would be quite a negative perception.
But does Roman Catholic Church play a particular role in turning a wolf into a symbol of lust, symbol of greed, symbol of aggression?
Yes, to a certain extent. The wolf is already a symbol of aggression in pre-Christian Europe, in pre-Christian Northern Europe, a symbol of violence with both positive and negative connotations. When Christianity is adopted slowly across Northern Europe, particularly in the Viking Age, in Northwestern Europe, Christian commentators refer to the wolf and start referring to the wolf in this negative way. Obviously also thinking of the pagan societies where the wolf is playing a more positive role. So for example, Scandinavian, we could call them Viking raiders, are often described as wolves in Christian chronicles when they are attacking Christian towns. And so this motif becomes popular, becomes widespread. So I think in a way, yes, Christians popularized this idea, but I suppose even in classical sources, so for example, Greek and Roman sources, you already have this sort of symbolism associated with the wolf. And then Christian authors, if you like, revive this in the second millennium, as a lot of classical metaphors for animals become adopted, particularly, for example, from the works of Aristotle or Pliny. So Christian commentators then adopt and perpetuate these negative symbols. And of course, they're taking their cue from the Bible. So one of the most common, if you like, symbolic uses of the wolf is as a false prophet, which comes directly from the Bible. So that then becomes used as a widespread metaphor of the devil coming in, attacking the sheep, which are essentially representing the Christian community. So then this becomes a popular metaphor. But the interesting thing is that it's not something that you see very often. So even though it's a recognizable symbol, for example, in the decoration of churches, we see it very rarely, really rarely featuring. It's interesting. The artists decorating churches across Northern Europe just don't seem to be very inspired or interested in the figure of a wolf. They fall back on more popular biblical animals like the lion or the dragon. The dragon becomes a much more popular symbol of evil in Northern Europe in the medieval period. And so the wolf seems to be sidelined. It seems to be something that is marginal. Perhaps it's something that becomes more important in areas that have wolf populations. But the artistic record tells us that it's not something that we see very often, which is interesting, compared to the pre-Christian period, where we have more representations of the wolf in terms of art, for example.
What sources did you use for the book that you prepared about wolves?
So for that book,
I'm talking about the book Wolves and the Wilderness in the Middle Ages.
Yeah. So that was the book of my PhD thesis. And for that, I had to draw on lots of different types of evidence, similar to what we talked about last time in relation to environmental archaeology.
Yeah.
So, of course, it included physical remains of wolves, which were very rare. So the bones of wolves recovered from archaeological sites. A lot of documentary evidence relating to, on the one hand, wolf hunting and the use of wolf fur in trade as an unusual commodity. Again, wolves were not very popular in terms of the commercial market for furs, but also literature. So we have a lot of poetry about wolves, a lot of fictional literature where wolves feature, particularly in the Scandinavian and the Icelandic body of literature. And arts, and I mentioned that we don't have much in the way of wolf representations in medieval art, but we do have more of that in the pre-Christian period in Northern Europe, where we have animals featuring widely in applied art on jewelry, for example, on weapons, on swords, on shields, and there we see the use of the wolf much more widely. I also had to reconstruct the environment, the habitat of the wolf, to try to understand why attitudes were changing and how they were connected with the environment, with the wolves' preferred habitats and also with the wolves' prey. So to do that, I had to then draw together all of the other sorts of environmental data and basically reconstruct the environments that people and wolves were sharing in Northern Europe. So really, it was a very diverse body of data. And actually, during the course of preparing this, I spent some time with biologists in Eastern Europe and in Scandinavia who were studying wolves to try to understand how wolves behave and how people understand them from a modern ecological perspective as well. So modern ecology played a role, anthropology, conservation, all of these different things came together. So it was quite challenging to draw together all those different lines of evidence, but also a lot of fun to do it at the same time.
did you study the big invasion of wolves in 1846? According to some chronicles, they invaded Europe, or the number of wolves increased in that year, in 846.
I didn't go that far into the future, or rather into the modern period.
Yeah.
But yes, you're right. There were allegedly increases in wolf attacks, especially in the 18th century, in the early 19th century, that led to increased persecution.
No, this one is 1846. We're talking about the early medieval period, because according to some chroniclers and scribes, the population of wolves increased in 9th century AD for some reason.
Sorry, you mean? So I thought you meant 1846 rather than 846.
846. 846.
Yes. So yeah, you have these documented accounts of wolf incursions actually throughout the early medieval period, where wolf packs are invading into towns as well as villages, and this continues into the high medieval period. I mean, I gather from what I recall, that period of the 9th century had a very harsh winter. Wolf packs were probably looking for food at a time of decreasing biodiversity, which is also when we know that we have improvised predation. And probably as a result of increasing cultivation, you also have people coming into contact with wolves more often. So that's why wolves start entering close to towns and villages within suburban areas. A few centuries later, they will be coming right up to the walls of Paris, and indeed into the suburbs occasionally. So I think that was, yes, those episodes happen every so often throughout the Middle Ages and are documented in the chronicles. It's difficult, isn't it, to be 100% certain whether these are accurate or not. But I think that it is entirely plausible that you would have had wolf packs coming into settlement areas at this time.
And of course, that fear of wolves increased the legend of them as sinister and demonic beings who terrorize humans in the countryside or even in towns. What's the status of wolves these days? I think they're eradicated in most of Europe these days.
Well, you may be surprised. They're actually recolonizing increasingly rapidly. So you now have quite a healthy wolf population in Eastern Europe, in parts of Poland that is moving through into Germany, and even, I believe, slowly moving into the Netherlands. And the Dutch, I gather, are prepared for the recolonization of some of their wilderness areas by wolves. You also have wolves in parts of Italy, in the uplands of northern Italy, crossing over into the Pyrenees, and then maybe even into Spain, according to some of the tagged animals that have been followed. And there are some small populations of the Iberian wolf in parts of Spain. So there are pockets. I believe that the wolf population in France is very limited because they are typically hunted by farmers as soon as they cross into French territory. And the wolf population in Norway is also very limited, if non-existent. There are regular wolf hunts in Norway. There is a wolf population in Sweden that is quite small, but crosses over into Norway occasionally, and this causes a lot of anxiety from the Norwegian government and Norwegian farmers. So I think wolves are moving through these old ecological corridors from Eastern Europe, probably from Eurasia, from Russia, from the steppes, into Western Europe slowly, and conservation is allowing them to recolonize some areas, such as in Poland, for example, and I think increasingly in Germany. But I think in places like France, it's going to be a difficult sell to rural communities especially. But I think conservationists are trying. So they are making a comeback. You were right, there was almost a complete collapse of the wolf population at the beginning of the 20th century, or in sort of the early decades of the 20th century. But it has slowly started to grow again.
How's the situation in the UK? Did
Oh,
they
well,
eradicate the wolf population in Britain?
That's right. So in the late medieval period, the wolf population in England vanishes by the end of the 14th century. That's the last reliable record that we have of wolves in northeastern England. And then there is another wolf population in Scotland that appears to be isolated, that survives a little longer, for a couple of centuries longer before that vanishes. So the wolf vanished completely, let's say by the 17th century, probably, in the British Isles. But there is talk of reintroduction. There has been now for a long time, but they haven't achieved this. And I think it's gonna take a long time to convince people that the wolf could be reintroduced. The argument that's been made is ecological, in order to maintain the growing deer population. But I don't think that the farmers are particularly comfortable with wolves being reintroduced, especially sheep farmers in Scotland and in Northern England. I think that will cause a lot of problems. If a wolf attacks even one sheep, it will be, you know, quite a big PR disaster. So we'll see what happens. There's a lot of people pushing for it, and not just the wolf, but also the lynx, the beaver, all these animals that became extinct in Britain at various points. There's a big movement to try to reintroduce them, but it's obviously sensitive and expensive as well, and difficult to do. So we'll see what happens. I mean, I doubt we'll see wolves in our lifetime in Britain, but you never know.
Was the wolf portrayed more negatively than the hare in medieval bestiary manuscripts? And we have all kinds of church documents, so-called bestiaries, in which they gave different attributes to wolves, hares, snakes, etc. So according to the medieval bestiary, if a wolf sees a man before the man sees the wolf, the man will lose his voice. If the man sees the wolf first, the wolf can no longer be fierce, etc. So they have all kinds of interesting descriptions of human-wolf relations and interaction between medieval humans and wild animals.
Yes, I think the wolf is probably one of the most negative elements of the bestiary, of these sort of compendia. But yeah, it's full of all these little stories. I think the hare is, you know, the hare is regarded as something that's small and timid and shy, but also quite promiscuous. That's more where its symbolism lies. The hare becomes associated with witchcraft much later on in the early modern period. But I don't think it's regarded in the medieval period as something threatening, whereas something like the wolf or the dragon or the lion. So the lion's an interesting symbol because the lion, like a lot of these animals, can be both a positive and negative symbol depending on, you know, the context. So the lion can be both a symbol of God, of Christ, of strength, of power, of nobility, but also a symbol of the devil and a symbol of violence, depending on the context. So yes, these books, we think, were designed initially for instructing monasteries, for monks and nuns within monasteries, because they're very metaphorical books. They basically teach you to look at creation and to understand the divine plan symbolically through all the different animals that are presented to us. And this was used for the instruction of monastic novices. And then ultimately, all of these symbols and motifs filter through into society. Although the examples that you've given of the wolf, for example, those stories are probably taken from popular folklore. and then incorporated into the bestiary. So we're seeing there sort of glimpses of local belief, popular belief in Northern Europe with stories about what the wolf can do. I mean, yes, it's difficult to take seriously now, isn't it?
Of course.
About these sorts of things. But they do provide an interesting glimpse into, if you like, how people may have understood animals like the wolf in the past.
What are your plans regarding wolf studies in Northern Europe? Are you planning to continue with studying the folklore? And as an archaeologist, what kind of archaeological evidence you managed to gather? You mentioned the environmental archaeology a few minutes ago.
I mean, the main evidence really is wolf bones of wolves, which are unusual in the historical period. They're more common in prehistoric contexts. But when you get to the historical period, after the Roman period, you have quite a big decline. And it probably means that people are hunting wolves in a different way, and we're not finding them, because we have documentary evidence later on of big wolf hunts, but we're just not finding the bones. So it probably means that we're not looking in the right places, or we simply won't be able to find them. So the data is quite fragmented. It really requires drawing on all of these different types of evidence. I mean, what I'd like to do, I've been thinking of doing this for a while now, is a European survey, a European history of the wolf, because my earlier work focused on Northwestern Europe, on Britain, Scandinavia, parts of the continental fringe. But I think it'll be interesting to do a sort of Europe-wide comparison, look at Eastern Europe, look at Southern Europe, and see if there is, if you like, a common approach to the wolf in the past, or if you have a lot of variations that depend on whether you have large packs of wolves present throughout the history of these cultures, whether Christianity plays a different role in other parts of Europe, and whether pre-Christian traditions continued in terms of how these animals are perceived. So it's a big project, but it's something that would be nice to do. I keep thinking about doing that kind of Europe-wide survey, and then seeing how that connects to North America, because of course then you have all of these migrants coming from Europe to North America and bringing their perceptions and attitudes to the North American wolf, which we know is then later hunted intensively and driven into almost extinction in much of the United States and parts of Canada. So it's interesting if you have, if you like, a translation of values from Europe to North America, and how that then is interacting with Native North American attitudes to the wolf that we know were much more positive. So that would be an interesting project to do at some point in the future. It will take a bit of time, but it's something that, yes, one day I'd like to do.
Thank you so much for your time. I know you're very busy. We can interrupt here, and we'll continue in a couple of weeks. I wish you Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. Hopefully 2022 will be much better for us than the last 2 years.
I hope so too, yes. Well, wishing you all the very best as well for Christmas and the new year, and looking forward to speaking to you on the other side.
Thank you so much. All the best.
Great. Thanks very much.